Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy Chadowsha. I'm the program coordinator here at the South Dakota Humanities Council, and I'm delighted that you could join us today. We're going to talk about the South Dakota deserts today. South Dakota has deserts, actually, a lot of them, but not the typical lack of rainfall kind. We're going to talk about the legal kind. Legal deserts are areas that are typically rural where there's a severe shortage of lawyers, maybe making it difficult for residents to access legal services and advice about issues ranging from wills and contracts to criminal defense. So today's guest is attorney and professor Hannah Haksgaard, and she literally has written the book on this issue. The book is entitled The Rural Lawyer: How to Incentivize Rural Law Practice and Help Small Communities Thrive, and it takes a deep dive into the issue of rural lawyer shortages and explains South Dakota's literally groundbreaking answer to the problem. We're honored to have Hannah with us today to talk about her book and inform us about access to justice and legal representation in our rural communities. So, Hannah, thank you for joining us. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, well, thank you, Stacey. I'm really happy to be here. This book was really a labor of love and took me quite a while to write, so it's always exciting to get to talk about it. So, as Stacey said, my name is Hannah Haksgaard. I'm a professor here at the University of South Dakota Knudsen School of Law in Vermillion. I teach classes on family law and property law, and I research on those topics, but I also research about the rural lawyer shortage. I'm originally from Yankton, so I'm a South Dakota native and I've lived in various parts of the state, including in Pierre, where I worked for a federal judge. I now live in Vermillion with my family. And sort of like what inspired me to write the book, I think a number of things did. One of the topics we'll talk about more in depth is that South Dakota truly is the nation's leader in having a program for a rural incentive program. And so having the ability to be a South Dakota person writing in South Dakota and to be able to tell the story of sort of the nation's first program to me was awesome. I also wanted to record that history and a little bit sort of to promote what South Dakota does is I wanted other states to learn from our program so that they could potentially do similar things. So I really saw this as an opportunity to record history, share with other states, and also like really research something that's like really interesting and really important.
So how did you embark on the journey of writing the book? Like what was the spark?
Yeah, so this was a 3-year project for me. I would say the spark actually lit a long time ago of I kind of said, this is really cool that South Dakota is the first state and I want to record that history. But then I kind of thought about it of like, well, at what point do you sit down and write an in-depth book about the program? So I actually decided to wait until the 10-year anniversary. So, leading up to the 10-year anniversary of the program, I decided to go out and interview all of the lawyers who'd been in the program. And so the book started by me driving around South Dakota to a bunch of small towns to learn about this rural practice. And so I got to visit a lot of South Dakota, a lot of small towns, and had this ability to sort of start with interviews and then go from there into the full-fledged book.
And I do want to put out there too, for those of you just joining us at Humanities Cafe for the first time, it is an interactive program. So if you want to ask Hannah a question, go ahead, raise your hand or just drop it in the chat and we'll get to it that way too, because there's a lot to unpack here. Hannah and I were talking just before we came on that there were so many things in this book that were interesting to talk about that I was like, how do you pick out what to talk about? But let's start with the basics. So what is meant by rural, first of all?
Yeah, so I'd say that rural is just really hard to define. Even the US Census, which you think about the census defines everything and categorizes everything, they don't even define rural. They just say rural is non-metropolitan, which I guess in a way is the definition, right? But it's interesting because almost every government metric that is distributing policies has a different definition of rural. In South Dakota for this program, what they did was they defined the qualifying rural counties as counties with populations under 10,000. So it is mostly a county by county designation, but also there are some really small towns in bigger counties that probably need lawyers. So think about the city of Wall, a very long way from Rapid City. Of course, Pennington County is over 10,000, yet Wall is the exact type of community that probably would need assistance. So there is a provision of for small towns like Wall in bigger counties, they can qualify as long as they're under 3,500 people. So that's sort of how the program defines rural is it's less than 10,000 per county or a town under 35,000. And if you hit one of those metrics, you qualify to participate in this program.
Okay. Well, I found when I was thinking about what is the definition of rural, and I looked it up, and South Dakota has 66 counties and 30 are rural. That's it. But 34 are frontier, which is smaller than rural. So less than, I think it's less than 6 people per square mile. And it's strange when you think about that in big picture. That's really a small population. So we're even less than rural. So
yes. And I
so
think that it's also too of, I think rural gets so hard to define for us because there's a question of population size, which is how this program decided to define it. But there's also this question of remoteness of how far are you from other communities of, say, McCook County, that's pretty small, but it's also relatively close to Minnehaha, right? So they have pretty easy access to Sioux Falls. And so there's this tension of there are counties that are actually really small and rural, and yet they're not particularly remote. And I think that's maybe why it's so hard to define rural for anything, is considering the population size, but also how distant you are from other services. But Stacy, you're right. I mean, it's a fascinating policy question of how we define these.
So moving into the rural lawyer shortage, then, what are some of the statistics or trends um, nationwide and then in South Dakota, but nationwide? This is a nationwide problem, right?
This absolutely is a nationwide problem. So, maybe other than a couple of those like really tiny states out in the Northeast, I would say every single state has a rural lawyer problem. I think there's a number of things that go into why does this happen. I mean, I think small towns generally have been struggling across America. Manufacturing jobs have left. Extractive industries have left. I mean, you think about there's fewer people with good jobs in rural communities. This whole brain drain problem makes it harder for us to recruit and retain our smart kids to go to school and then come back home. The other thing is baby boomers are retiring. And as they retire, we're losing small lawyers and not enough lawyers are replacing them. If you go and talk to state bar leaders and lawyers in any state, they're going to say, we have this problem. Now, the problem might be slightly different or the numbers might be different, but this truly is a nationwide problem. Now, in terms of South Dakota, what are our statistics and trends like here? Is overall what you see happening is in generations past, there were more towns that just had a single lawyer sitting on Main Street who was a general provider and did general work. And as those folks have retired, they found it really hard to recruit replacements. So then what happens is once you start losing a lawyer here and a lawyer there in small towns, suddenly we start to get what we call legal deserts, which is these big areas where we just don't have enough lawyers to meet the local legal needs.
Well, when I was looking up the statistics when I was reading your book, I found it said 72% of all South Dakota attorneys live in 4 cities: Aberdeen, Pierre, Sioux Falls, and Rapid City. And only 35% of South Dakotans live in those cities. So that's kind of puts it big picture, I mean, really lays it out for you, because I mean, I'm here at Brookings, and I'm like, Brookings didn't even make that list. But yeah. So what makes rural law practice different from that of more populous areas?
So that's, I think the biggest difference is probably just lifestyle of if I'm meeting with a student and kind of saying like, hey, what do you want to do with your career? If they're considering rural law, I think truly lifestyle is going to be the biggest difference. If you are a Main Street lawyer in a small town, then you are kind of the problem solver who's sitting there on Main Street and is kind of the person that everyone goes to. And that, you're very visible, you're very engaged in community, in the life of the community. But lawyers in big cities have different types of work. They might specialize more. So I think the lifestyle is maybe the biggest thing, but there's probably other differences, such as like the specific areas of law that you might practice.
So what legal issues then are most common in a rural legal setting?
Yeah,
and
so
what,
I think,
oh, go ahead, sorry.
well, I was going to say that I think land ownership is maybe the big thing that really stands out. So, when I talked to the rural lawyers about what type of work that they were doing, almost everybody is working with land. So the inheritance of land, so writing wills, writing trusts, doing probate, which is what happens after someone dies, doing land transactions where land is transferring. So that was a pretty big part of people's practices in rural areas.
And is that specifically more challenging in Indian country with the land ownership piece?
Oh, yes, this is absolutely more challenging in Indian country. And I'd say there's a number of ways that Indian country is unique for lawyers. And one of them is that the trust relationship between the federal government and tribes means that a lot of land on reservations is in trusts. And if land is in trusts, it's like different in a number of ways. But what that means is an attorney in Indian country, less of their business is going to be transferring land between families, which is a lot of other rural lawyers' business. It also means that when we do need to transfer land in Indian country, those wills actually end up being more complicated, take a lot more work. So that is a major difference of how things maybe play out for lawyers in and outside of Indian country.
And for rural attorneys, go ahead.
Stacy,
go ahead.
I just saw, so I clicked on the messages and it looks like Christina has a question. Is it okay if we take that?
Absolutely. Sorry, Christina.
Okay.
No, you're fine. Hi,
the conversation.
Hello, my name is Christina Wee. I'm actually the executive director at the Humanities Council. Sorry for having my camera off today. I'm working from home and no one wants to see that. But my husband Graham, he's actually about to hop on here, is an attorney, and he's from Sisseton, South Dakota, but he works for the city of Sioux Falls now. He's also been a prosecutor, and one of the things that I'm wondering if you could touch on that I find weirdly fascinating is how some in rural small communities, attorneys like Tom Maher, I'm not calling out Tom, I love him to death, but he can have a private practice as well as serve as the public defender. I don't think many people know that. And I wonder if you could talk about it.
I would love to talk about that because I actually think this is, it's true. So let me just repeat what Christina said, which is that in rural communities, most of the government jobs are part-time. So a rural county does not have enough people or tax money to hire a full-time city attorney or a full-time prosecutor or a full-time defense attorney. They just can't justify those expenses. So instead, what they do is they hire part-time lawyers. And, there's a number of different ways you can structure pay and all of that stuff. But the outcome of it becomes that in a rural community, I have somebody who is a part-time prosecutor, but also runs their own business, or they're a part-time public defender and also runs their own business. So they're a part-time city attorney. Maybe they even are city attorney for 8 cities, right? In this little neck of the woods where they're at. And they're also a private attorney. So that is absolutely something that happens across rural South Dakota. Now, there are a few things that maybe come up from that. And I would start by saying, I actually think that this is a really good thing about the way that South Dakota runs. So other states have kind of taken the rural counties will work together and they'll pay one full-time public defender who might cover 6 or 8 counties. Well, you can understand the value of that looks like we're specializing. The problem with it is that one attorney then has a whole lot more travel to do to get to all those counties. They're not actually local everywhere. Tax dollars from one county is paying an attorney somewhere else, and he's his house is here and he's spending money here rather than back in the local community. So I think there's some downsides of that. But I actually think one of the biggest problems is that a lot of these rural attorneys rely on this part-time government work for steady income. So, right, if you're this part-time, say, city attorney, and the city, you know that they're going to pay you $1,000 a month or whatever it is. That amount of work you can control and you can rely on that income. And so those set contracts where you know that income is coming in is actually really important to small town attorneys who otherwise might have big fluctuations in the amount of work they can take. And so I think there's value, because the other reality of it is that there may not be enough legal work for a full-time private practitioner. And so if the only thing available is picking up paid clients locally, you might not be able to sustain a lawyer. But if that lawyer has a contract that says 25% of my time I'm going to be a prosecutor, well, they might be able to fill up that other 75% and financially survive. But without those government contracts, they wouldn't be able to make it. So I guess, Christina, that's my kind of answer to that, is like, I think it's important. I think it's part of sustaining rural lawyers. And I actually tend to think it's good for the communities, because then it's more likely that your government contracts are staying local with lawyers rather than smushing a bunch of entities together and paying somebody who drives in.
Thank you. I just found that so fascinating when I found that out. I was like, how come no one knows about this?
Yes.
Well, and it makes me question too, what do you do if there's like what would be considered a conflict of interest, where as a private attorney, you're in conflict with what the city wants? How do they handle that then?
Yeah, so, conflicts as lawyers, and maybe I think about this more as a law professor, right, who's training the next generation, is we think a lot about conflicts, and I think that we train lawyers pretty well to really focus on conflicts and make sure that they never take representation where they have this issue. So I think the reality of rural practice is that a rural lawyer is more likely to get into conflict situations than an urban lawyer, simply because there's a smaller pool of lawyers who are working with all of the same people in a community. And so it's more likely then that your client A is going to ultimately end up in a lawsuit with client B. The reality is that there's rules that require that lawyers withdraw from those types of situations. But it also means that a county is going to have conflict counsel. So if I'm an attorney and I have this client and I've written like wills for his family, or I've transferred land or something like that, but I'm also a part-time prosecutor, and suddenly I get an arrest warrant and I know I need to charge this guy with, I don't know, a DUI, right? What I'm probably actually going to do is I'm going to call up the county next door, and say, hey, I'm conflicted out. I need somebody else to do the charging, and we're going to transfer it. So these rural attorneys are going to have people that they can transfer stuff out to, but it absolutely 100% is something that they have to be watching out for, and they know to watch out for it, because they know this is one of the kind of struggles of being a rural attorney, is you're going to face more conflicts.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have a question? Then we'll shift a little bit to more towards the book. But if anybody else has a question, raise your hand, drop it in the chat. Okay, so we're gonna shift a little bit here. Like I said, I bookmarked the book. I feel like I'm in college again. But your book clearly illustrates the realities of rural jurisdictions across the nation, but it also tells a story unique to South Dakota, right? It's our state's innovative attempt to fund the recruitment of rural lawyers. How did this even come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the most amazing things, is when people hear like, well, South Dakota is the nation's leader, they think, well, how did that happen? And I think the short answer is that we live in a state where people still care about rural areas. I mean, that's the short answer, right? But I think the longer answer is that we got lucky if there were a number of people kind of in leadership positions at the right time who were able to push something through. So Chief Justice Gilbertson, now retired, but he was our Chief Justice of the South Dakota Supreme Court for many years. Actually, about 20 years ago, he started, when he'd give his State of the Judiciary speech to the legislature, he started talking about this problem because he's from Sisseton, right? So he's a small town guy. He started as a small town lawyer and he started identifying that this was an issue. And he just started telling the legislature every year, one of our growing problems is that these rural attorneys are retiring and no one is going to replace them. So you had Chief Justice Gilbertson who starts to talk about it, starts to make it a known entity. We have the lawyers in South Dakota exist under, there's this organization called the State Bar of South Dakota. So the State Bar is just the member org for all the lawyers. There's a new president elected each year. The State Bar president in 2011 was Pat Getzinger. And Pat Getzinger from Martin, currently in Rapid City, he's a rural kid. He sees the same exact thing happening. And each State Bar president is supposed to have a program or an activity that they do. Pat decided to focus on rural lawyers. So you have the Chief Justice, you have the State Bar president, and this is kind of, these conversations are going on about sort of like, let's do something. And this magic kind of moment almost happened where Senator Mark Valley from Mitchell, during a legislative session in 2013, stood up and said, okay, actually, I want to sponsor a bill and make something happen. But because he was hearing from these other people of like, we've got a problem, we've got to do something.
So from that, then they created the Project Rural Practice Task Force, right? That's a lot of words. And that's with the State Bar of South Dakota. And so when I was reading the book, I'll just read what I tabbed here. When South Dakota developed its program, two main benefits dominated the discussions: access to justice and the economic viability of rural communities. What is meant by economic viability of rural communities in this context?
Yeah. So I will just step back and say, yes. So Project Rural Practice Task Force, that's what comes out of the State Bar. Pat Getzinger is the one who's in charge of creating that. He works with his friend Bob Morris from Belfouche, right? So you've got these kind of rural attorneys working together, and they started talking about how can we create a program that encourages more rural lawyers. And then to this kind of quote you say is, yes, I think that when we started talking, we as in the state of South Dakota and the leaders started talking about this, there's this question of why should the state invest resources in lawyers, right? Lawyers are not traditionally a well-loved profession, right? I mean, lawyers have a lot of jokes, right? Shakespeare was writing jokes about lawyers. It's not like lawyers have as easy of a time getting support as, like, say, teachers or nurses, where there have been long-term programs. So then this question arises is like, well, we've never needed programs before. Why should we invest in a program to encourage rural lawyers? And so, Stacy, that brings me to the quote you read, which is, I think there's two main arguments from a state perspective of why we want to do this. So the first being access to justice. And this simply means getting more people good legal representation that they need, whether that's in criminal defense or whether that's in civil litigation, whatever it might be, is making sure that people with legal needs get connected to lawyers who can serve them. But then the other one is this economic viability argument. And this kind of starts percolating pretty early. And I think this matters to Senator Valley, who ultimately proposes the legislation, is this recognition that a lawyer in a small town has this unique ability to help that small town's economic development because they can serve local clients, right? They're going to collect money, they're going to run businesses, all of that sort of thing. But they're also going to make sure that nonprofits are properly formed. They're going to do business documents to get new businesses going. Current businesses who maybe have questions about, like, oh, there's this law, how do I comply with it? Well, a lawyer can do that compliance advising, make sure that businesses stay healthy, right? And so I think one of the reasons of, like, well, why do we invest in lawyers? Well, if I can get a lawyer to a Main Street law office, not only do they serve individual clients, but they're going to help sustain that rural community.
There's a question from Christina in the chat. With the state bar pushing a CLE requirement, how do you think that will affect rural practice attorneys? Good question.
Yeah, so the state is considering requiring the lawyers take continuing legal education credits and sort of get a certain number of credits you have to check off each year. I don't think that this is going to have any kind of different impact on rural attorneys versus urban attorneys. I think that the state of South Dakota, the state bar so far has been really great about offering easy to access CLE opportunities. There's always already kind of really encouragement for rural lawyers to gather at CLE type events, so they can network with other lawyers, not kind of like if you're the only person in your firm, it's really important you go out to events so you can meet other lawyers. So I actually don't see the impact of this as being too different. I think that it will roll out very similarly for a rural lawyer versus the lawyers in our bigger cities. Maybe a little bit more drive time, right? It's not like Martin is going to host its own CLE, but I think those lawyers are already making trips to Pierre and Rapid City for events where they'll be able to add that into their kind of annual, like, how do I stay updated and how do I stay engaged?
Okay, so out of this Rural Practice Task Force was born the South Dakota Rural Attorney Recruitment Program. How can you just tell us about the program in general and kind of what the provisions, especially for how do counties and communities get set up to participate in the program?
Right. So the task force is this kind of committee that's like looking for ideas. The Rural Attorney Recruitment Program is the idea that ends up getting codified in state law. So that during the 2013 legislative session, Senator Valley brings this legislation, it makes it through, Governor Dugard signs it, we get this new legislation. And when it gets into law, it creates what we now call the Rural Attorney Recruitment Program. And it has this basic provision of essentially what happens is that a lawyer who is going to go to one of the qualifying rural communities, which we already talked about, right? That's the under 10,000 for a county or under 3,500 for a town. A lawyer who's going to go to one of those communities basically makes a 5-year commitment to live and work in that rural community providing legal services. If they do that, they get a stipend of about $12,500 a year for 5 years, for kind of staying present and being in that community. Now, Stacy, you mentioned specifically the requirements for the local community of what they have to do. The local government, either the city or the county, has to actually sign the contract and say, we want this attorney here and we buy into this, or signing the contract. There's a contract provision in it. And they have to pay 35% of the stipend. So there is absolutely kind of a requirement that local governments are invested and interested in having these lawyers here, because the local communities do have to kick in.
Well, and you mentioned the they pay the 35%. And I believe the unified judicial system pays, do they pay 50%?
50%.
And then somebody, I can't remember, so another entity pays like another 15%.
Yeah, so yes. And I saw
State
a comment about the definition of CLE, right? The continuing legal education. So just Stacey mentioned the unified judicial system, also called UJS, and that is really the unified judicial system basically refers to the state courts. So that is state money. So the state, through the unified judicial system, aka the state courts, that kind of how they get administered, they pay 50%. Then the local community pays 35%, and then the state bar, which again, the state bar is this group of lawyers, the state bar pays 15%. And so there's now kind of sustaining funds for that, but that is traditionally, I mean, that is funded through donations from lawyers. So lawyers across the state have the ability to donate into this state like the state bar funds that then gets distributed to pay that 15%. It was really important to the sponsors of the legislation that it was a shared cost. They did not want the state just paying the whole stipend and not having the legal community or the local community engaged in it. So this cost splitting was a way to make sure that several entities had major investments in these new lawyers.
So for potential lawyers or somebody fresh out of thinking in law school, thinking about, maybe this sounds like a good idea. I got a few questions, I guess. Is there a limited number of participants? How are they chosen? And then what requirements are do they have to fulfill through their signed contract?
Yeah. So is there a limited number? So it's technically limited to 32 lawyers at a time. But once those slots, so you only are in a slot for 5 years. So once somebody's been in the program for 5 years and they graduate, which is I would call, right? They graduate from the program, their slot reopens. So we can have way more than 32 attorneys. We can only it's just that we can only have 32 attorneys at a time. So, and we've at this point had 35 lawyers participate, but we've never been close to that 32 in there at a time. So I think there's plenty of slots for them. Now in terms of how they're chosen, there's more spots, I think, than we can ever fill on any one year. And so we work together. So the state law school, the University of South Dakota Law School, works with the state bar, who works with the unified judicial system. And we work together to do recruiting and try to identify lawyers who would be interested in this and make sure that those lawyers then kind of can get matched up. Then we start working with communities and saying well, what community is willing to sign a contract? What lawyer out there is willing to bring a new lawyer into their firm? And so they're chosen because they kind of have to self-identify to us as I'm open to rural practice. And as soon as they say that, I think there's a team of people who are just here ready to step in and say, hey, we'll help you get into a good situation. So I think, Stacey, you had one more part of that, if I'm remembering
Yeah, what are the
correctly.
requirements that they have
Yes.
to fulfill then in that contract?
Absolutely. Right. So you have to stay in your rural community for 5 years. Of course, it has to be in an eligible county. And when the requirements for the lawyer is that they have to live in the county where they signed and they have to work in the county where they signed. There's also a pro bono requirement. It's kind of pro bono is the language that lawyers use to refer to free legal services. But I actually think that the living and working in the county piece is a really important piece of this, because this to me really links with community engagement and why lawyers help communities. Is that when a lawyer is living and working in the same place, they get really involved with community. It's not that they just have an office where they see clients. They are going to a local church. Their kids are going to the local school. When the lawyer decides to do service work, right? Whether it's serve on the school board or be on the board of a nonprofit or, be in charge of setting up the local Easter egg hunt, whatever it is, the lawyer is in the community, and what they're incentivized to do is volunteer in the community where they work. So I think one of the smart things that the South Dakota folks did when they wrote this law was say that you have to live and work in the same county where your contract is, because that really brings together the community aspects of what a lawyer can bring.
Is there any way to incentivize, if an attorney is wanting to take in this program, participate in this program, what if their spouse has, there's always the concern of what if my spouse can't find a job? Is there any consideration taken into that?
That I would say is at the individual community level, right? So if I had, I should say but if we as the broader community of people who want to encourage new lawyers, if we have a law student who says I would love to go into this program, but my spouse is a teacher or my spouse is a nurse and we need to make sure that they can get a job, this is one of those things where, okay, we're going to start talking to a community, and that community needs to think about whether they can do something to help that spouse get a job. There's no provisions in this particular state statute that says, oh, well, we'll make sure that that spouse has a job. But this is where it kind of falls from, well, there's the official program and it provides your stipend to look at those individual communities and say, community, what can you do to make this better for this young attorney who wants to come? And I think, honestly, is like one of the biggest things that like those communities can do is make sure that if there is a spouse, that spouse can find work that's going to keep that spouse happy.
And Christina, you said that happened to me. Do you want to comment further on that? What that experience was like?
Yeah, so my Graham's actually on this call too, but when Graham graduated law school in 2012, there's not that many entry level attorneys at that point. We were just coming out of the recession and all this stuff. So he was lucky and got a job in Pierre, not very quote unquote rural, but still a smaller community. And it was pretty much, an awesome job. He was attorney for School of Public Lands, going to be working in the Capitol, but okay, what do I do? So we moved, and I actually took a month off because I couldn't find a job anywhere. I wound up getting, because my background's in nonprofits, so I wound up getting a temporary job at the American Cancer Society, then working for state government for only I think 6 months. But it's funny enough, I was able to get the most amazing job. I became the executive director of the Capital Area United Way, and that seriously promoted my career. And funny enough, when you mentioned the community needs to come together, that's kind of what happened. Was my husband's coworker said, "Hey, there's this job that came up. We think your wife should apply." And yeah, so it was interesting. It kind of goes to what you said. The community got involved to help keep us there. So
And I'm glad you found us eventually.
yeah, now I'm in Sioux Falls and I drive up to Brookings.
So this program sounds incredible. So what has been the success of the program so far?
So my opinion is that this has been a big success. And I'll back up just slightly to say, since this program was signed into law in 2013, myself and a bunch of other people across the country keep saying, like, South Dakota is the leader on this issue, right? There's this awesome New York Times article about it early on. There's all of this scholarship where I keep saying we have this rural lawyer shortage and identify all these problems, but then I say, and South Dakota has a solution, right? And so, but we kept saying South Dakota is a solution with maybe like not really knowing if it was actually successful. Like, yes, we were the first to pass a statute. We're the first to really do anything. But if after 10 years, nobody's doing the program anymore, I think I maybe need to stop saying that. So one of my goals with writing this book was to actually kind of figure out, if has this program been successful, or did we try something and honestly not that great, we should try something else. When I think about this program, my view on it is major success. So at the 10-year point, we had exactly 75% retention. So 75% of the lawyers who ever started were still in rural practice. That number continues to actually be very similar, because since that the 10-year anniversary now was almost 2 years ago. But we've had a few more join, a few more leave to transition to other jobs. But we hang around that 75% retention. And I think that's a really big success. Is we know that the current reality is that a lot of people start jobs and they move and they move and they move, right? The economy is different than it was 50 years ago when people got a job and they worked there for their entire careers. And so, I think that Some movement is natural. Some people are going to say, actually, I don't want to be a lawyer at all. Some people are going to say, my spouse had needs, we need to move on. Some people are going to say, hey, I actually got my dream job. A couple of our folks got dream jobs in Pierre, which sort of back to Christina's point, is like not exactly rural, but also really small town and is in more need of lawyers. And so to me, I think the program has worked really well. And I think it's something that other states should emulate. I also think it's something that South Dakota really needs to continue to support because it's a place where we're a national leader.
So in terms of retention, are you referring to sticking through the 5 consecutive years or after they've completed their contract?
I'm actually talking after they've completed their contract, that they are just still lawyers in rural areas. So way more than 75% have completed the 5 years, but 75% who ever started even like 1 week on the ground are still rural lawyers. And the first ones who joined, it's now been 11 years. So they graduated from the program 6 years ago. And we have this group of lawyers who's just still serving rural South Dakota. And I think for many of them, it's very truthful to say without the program, they would not have decided to go into rural practice. So you can point around the state and say, this town has a lawyer because of the program. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing.
So are there any plans to change or expand the program?
So right now, in terms of the rural attorney recruitment program and the way it's written in the statute, there's no particular plans to change it. I mean, I think that it's always worth discussing whether we need to do any sort of monetary increase to kind of match inflation, because that number hasn't changed since the legislation in 2013. And of course, inflation has changed since 2013. So I think that's perpetually going to be a topic of discussion. But I think the bigger kind of changes of step forwards of what we're doing in South Dakota relates for other ways to support rural attorneys. So if we continue to think about the rural attorney recruitment program as our like big piece of legislation that really does the most work to help legal deserts, we also have to think about other ways to support and encourage rural lawyers. So the state bar is making a push to do more recruitment, get more lawyers to go volunteer in schools so more rural students can see that rural law practice is a viable option. I was part of a team that wrote a Department of Justice grant that we actually received the grant. And so we have money that is going to be used to spend on kind of creating a hub of advice for new lawyers to fill in some of those mentorship gaps. Because I think one of the things I learned in my book is that no matter how hard people try, the mentorship piece is still a really big issue in rural areas because it's honestly just hard. Like you need a good mentor, attorneys are stretched thin. And so this DOJ grant is going to kind of help us kind of pick up little pieces that maybe get dropped. And so I would say in general is I think that the group who's leading the South Dakota program is doing a good job of continuing to push forward and look for other ways we can support rural attorneys while still appreciating that we have this mainstay legislation that keeps us going.
Della has a really good question in the chat. He said, to what extent are USD graduates taking advantage of the program, and are students from other law schools and states eligible? That's a good question.
Yeah. Great question. So I think one of the nice things again about this program is that the USD Knudsen School of Law is a major partner, but the legislation is written very broadly. So you do not have to be from South Dakota. You do not have to be a USD student in order to take advantage. So a few of the practicing attorneys did not come through USD, but most of them have. So you are absolutely eligible from outside. It just is that most of our recruiting is from USD students. And so to what extent are USD students taking advantage? We graduate 1 or 2 or 3 students a year who go into the program. So that's a really small percentage, right? We're talking maybe 2 to 3% of our class on average enters the program, but I don't need to have 10% of my graduating students go every year. I just need to have a steady supply of 1 or 2 a year who opt into it. And so I think that the thing that USD is really trying to do is make sure that our students are aware that this is a viable career opportunity, so that when they graduate, they're educated that like, actually, I can go home if I want to. And we can't make them do it, of course, right? But we want to make sure that they know about it. So I think we're doing a pretty good job of that. Students continue to take advantage a couple a year, and every once in a while we get somebody in from out of state who signs up for the program as well.
Thank you for that question, Del. In terms of the community now, what more needs to be or can be done to better assist the communities in regard to legal assistance? Because I'm going to need one more little piece out of the book. You said, in many ways, the rural attorney recruitment program works because of localism. The lawyers in communities who have invested in this program do so because they believe they're making their communities stronger and are evidencing what is one of the strongest arguments for localism, that making the world a better place requires investment, not investment in the abstract, but investment in particular communities. So what's the community's role in making this program work and in making these attorneys successful?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So as much as this is like a state level program, right? I mean, it absolutely requires that communities want this. I mean, it requires that communities sign the contract. It requires that communities pony up 35% of the money. But it also just like generally, I think, means that communities have to be open and excited about new lawyers coming. And so a community member who's a real estate agent who kind of says, hey, I'm going to find you housing, right? Somebody stands up and says, I'm going to find you housing. Somebody else stands up and says, we're going to make sure you have office space, right? Because if you're joining an existing firm, pretty easy, right? They're going to clean out a little storage area and there's an office for you. But if you're a new solo practitioner, it is daunting to think I have to sign a lease for office space. So this is like I think to me kind of some beautiful moments of communities coming together and saying, hey, we realize that first year it's really scary to get office space. So maybe the county cleans out an empty office in the county building, or a city owns just an empty storefront downtown and they say, we're going to lease this to you for pennies on the dollar of what it's worth for just a couple of years while you get your feet wet. So essentially provide you almost like free office space, right? So communities stepping forward and doing that stuff, but also communities being willing to be welcoming to this new lawyer, both personally, right? Of like, be friendly, make sure they feel like they're part of the community, and also professionally of bring them business. Because if nobody is bringing business to the local lawyer cannot survive. And I think this, Stacy, goes to this localism point is localism kind of gets a bad rap sometimes, right? Of like, we should care about everyone in the world. True. We want everyone in the world to have a great life, but there becomes this point of like, well, can you make the biggest difference? Well, it's people who care about the same community. And if you hire a lawyer who's going to spend their volunteer time, their tax time, their business time, all of that stuff in your local community, their focus on the community and clients' focus on the community is really what makes it work. And in my mind, this is just generally speaking how we make sure that small towns survive, right? If all of us take all of our business to Sioux Falls for everything, the small town starts suffering, right? Is you have to kind of choose to invest locally if you want your local communities to survive.
So what do you think, what else could be done to incentivize attorneys to practice in rural communities?
I think one of the biggest things is making sure that we tell rural students that this is a viable job. I think for a long time, the rural students have heard the message that there are no good jobs in rural America. If you want to be successful in your career, you got to go get educated and jump to one of the bigger towns, or even out of state to the Twin Cities or Denver, right? And do something really big. And I think that some of that messaging from parents, from teachers, from local attorneys who hopefully show up in the schools and volunteer changes a little bit to say, you actually can have a very successful career by being a lawyer in a small town. And so I think that a community insistence of like, we're not a dying community, right? Like we just need to retain some of our people and not lose them all to brain drain is huge. And then I think those communities just also have to be open to new folks moving to town, right? You might not get a homegrown kid who comes, but you might have a lawyer who grew up on a ranch 4 hours away and is saying like, don't really want to do ranch life, but I like a small town. And they may be a new face in town, but are somebody who will stay and practice law for 40 years. So I think a lot of that openness and encouraging kids to come back to rural America is a pretty important piece of it.
Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left. So let's turn this on you now. So what, if anything, has changed since you completed this book?
Oh, sure. So, I think that not a lot has changed policy-wise. So in like some ways, not a lot has changed. In other ways, plenty has changed. I mean, every time a new group graduates, we have new lawyers join. We've had a couple of lawyers leave the program, go elsewhere. So some of the people in the book who I talk about being rural lawyers have now moved on to other jobs. The Project Rural Practice Task Force has started to work on other things. I know I had talked about the DOJ grant for like a mentorship hub before. So I think that has changed, but I think the big picture of we are in desperate need of recruiting new lawyers continues to be essentially the same as it was when I wrote the book.
So what was the most challenging thing about writing the book?
So I think the hardest thing going into it was I was really worried about being objective about the program, and making sure that I was fair about the program because I didn't want to write a book that was just a hype piece, right? Simply because I'm aware of the program. I didn't want to get out there and be like, oh, South Dakota is the best without having the data to support that. I also think for me, it was like kind of stressful because these rural lawyers, they let me visit them in their home, in their like offices, in their small towns. They let me watch them in court or in city council meetings where they're doing their job. They let me kind of see how they're living life as a rural lawyer. And I wanted to do their stories justice. And that's a little scary, right? Is taking these stories of people who were really generous with their time and stories and making sure that I captured it. To me, that was really the most challenging part about writing it, but in many ways also the most joyful, right? Is it was really rewarding to go out there and do that.
That was going to be my next question. What was most rewarding
sure.
about writing this book? There's another question. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it really was visiting people in their small towns. I mean, it's like, it's hard to express like kind of how stressful it is to say, hey, tell me everything about your career. And I promise you I will do it justice, but that makes it so rewarding. And I think one of the things I've taken when I've heard from readers so far is what readers have said to me is like, the policy analysis is useful, right? I'm glad that you've done this, but it was also really special reading this because I got this like picture into what it's like to be a small town lawyer. The only way I was able to provide that is having these rural lawyers who let me in and let me follow them around and like kind of see what life was like.
So one more question here from Dell says, any ideas on how to improve the program?
Yeah, so I think that there's a number of tweaks we can make. I mean, Dal, my first answer is like, I think we did pretty well. And when the state of South Dakota wrote legislation, there was no one to copy, right? We had to make it all up ourselves. I think there's a few things that, have modified slightly. So I think increased focus on mentorship and making sure the program is a little more strict about making sure that new lawyers have mentors, which they've actually just kind of written into the program as an important thing. I think almost running a secondary program that is focused on helping new solo practitioners initially might be the biggest thing. Is if you're walking into a firm, I think the program's running great. If you're walking in and opening your own firm on day one, I almost think that we kind of need a supplemental program for a new solo practitioner to just almost walk you through those first couple months. A little startup cost, more hands-on mentoring. That to me would be the biggest thing. I ask all the lawyers this question. All of the existing lawyers, by far the most predominant answer was make sure there's good mentorship. For kind of older lawyers who had been mentors, what they talked about is just like focus on recruiting. Is the program administrators, the law school, everybody in the state of South Dakota needs to do more recruiting. So I think there's a whole lot of stuff that it's almost like we can do a lot of things better and improve it of what we're already doing within the program.
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Del. So Hannah, what do you most hope readers will take away from your book?
Yeah, so I think that different readers will take different things, but I would say if I could encapsulate that in one thing, is that I hope that readers will recognize that rural lawyers are really important to sustaining rural communities. Like that's an important part of keeping rural communities healthy, but also that being a rural lawyer can be a satisfying career. So I hope there's at least one person who picks up this book and says, I didn't know what I want to do with my life, but I love living in my rural community. And they think to themselves, actually, I'm going to bop down to Vermilion for 3 years, get my JD, and come back. So I hope there's at least one of those, but I hope in general, people realize that there's this interconnectedness, that lawyers are good for rural communities and rural communities are good for lawyers.
I think there's a lot to be said for that too, because for someone who might be in a rural community, a young person in a rural, or even the parents of someone who in a rural community who, is the legal field really something that's gonna pay the bills, in a rural area. If you like, I think some in your book you said if you want to visit the symphony, rural law is not for you. But if you like rodeos, if you like parades, if you like that local community aspect, there's real possibilities with this with the program. I think it's fantastic,
Yes.
and I love what it's doing. So, in terms of what you're going to be doing, do you have any future projects or writing? Are you going to do a sequel to this book?
Well, I think right now, what I'm actually focused on is taking this information I learned and talking to other states about it.
Mm.
And so I love, of course, getting to tell people in South Dakota about this program because I think we should all be incredibly proud of what we've done. But I also want you to know that like one of my main project for probably the next year or two is talking to state bar leaders or state government leaders in other states and saying, look what South Dakota did. Look at its successes and consider replicating it. Maybe you want to tweak it, right? Maybe your state's a little bit different, but making sure that I kind of keep up this energy of sharing this information with other states so everyone can understand of like really what a good thing South Dakota did here.
Well, I know I look forward to hearing you speak at the Festival of Books in September. I'm bringing my copy of the book for you to sign it. And we are running out of time. So I do want to thank everybody for joining us today and invite you back next Thursday. We're going to be talking to another festival author. Her name is Dr. Barb Bausted. She is a meteorologist, climatologist, and she is going to talk about her new book called Wilder Weather. What Laura Ingalls Wilder can teach us about watching the weather, understanding our climate, and protecting what we cherish. And it's about paying attention to the weather, but also realizing what a profound impact that can have on our everyday lives. So, and on top of that, I invite you all to come to the Festival of Books in Spearfish on September 26th and 27th. We're going to have a great time. Lots of great authors, including Hannah. And I did put a link to the book in the chat. I advise check it out. It's really good. Like yeah. I found a lot of really useful information and a lot of the anecdotes about the participants it was fun to read about how the program has changed their lives and how their lives are working as attorneys in rural communities. So thank you for joining us today, Hannah. Thank you everyone else for joining in, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.